Ruth Calloway heard her father name Clara's price at the supper table. $300 and a deed transfer, same as selling a horse at auction. She didn't cry. She didn't say a word. She walked straight out to the barn in the November dark, pressed her forehead against her mare's neck, and made herself a promise. Whatever Elias Weston was, rich, ruthless, a stranger who'd ridden in from Wyoming with cold eyes and a cash offer, he was not walking out of this house with her sister's future stuffed in his coat pocket. Not without hearing the truth first. If Ruth's story already has you leaning forward, hit that subscribe button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this woman's courage travels. Now settle in, because what happens next changes everything. The wagon came in from the North Road just after sundown, and Harold Callaway had been watching for it since noon. He'd changed his shirt twice. He'd told Clara to wear the blue dress, the good one with the ivory buttons their mother had sent from St. Louis the Christmas before she died. He'd told Ruth to stay out of the front room unless she was carrying something. Ruth had been carrying something since she was 14 years old. She was used to it. She stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the hallway, a dish towel in her hands, and listened to her father's boots cross the floorboards for the dozenth time. Back and forth, like a man pacing the length of his own coffin. "He's late," Harold muttered. "It's only just dark, Father." "I said he'd be here by dark. It's dark." Ruth folded the towel. "The road from Cheyenne takes longer in November. The mud's heavy." "I didn't ask for your assessment of the road conditions, Ruth." She put the towel down. In the parlor, Clara sat very still in the blue dress. Her hands were folded in her lap. Her hair was pinned up in the soft way that made men forget to finish their sentences. Clara had their mother's coloring, pale and gold, and she knew precisely what effect it produced. Not because she was vain, but because she'd been told about it so many times it had stopped feeling like a compliment and started feeling like a job. "Do I look all right?" Clara asked quietly. Ruth looked at her sister. 21 years old, dressed like a Sunday offering, waiting to be inspected by a man neither of them had ever met. "You look beautiful," Ruth said. "You always do." "That's not what I asked." Ruth crossed the room and sat beside her sister on the settee. "Clara, don't." Clara's voice was careful and very controlled. "Don't tell me it's going to be fine. Don't tell me Mr. Weston is probably a decent man. You don't know that, and neither does Father, and I am very tired of being told things nobody actually knows." Ruth was quiet. Clara was right, and they both knew it. "Is Violet asleep?" Clara asked. "Since supper. She had a bad afternoon with her leg." Clara nodded. The leg had been bad more often lately. The cold settled into it in a way that made Violet go white around the mouth and not say anything, because Violet never complained, which was its own kind of terrible to watch. "If Father's debts don't get settled," Clara said carefully, "Violet doesn't get the medicine she needs through the winter." "I know. And the bank takes the property in March." "I know that too." "So?" Clara smoothed an invisible wrinkle from her skirt. "So here we are." Here they were. Ruth had run the numbers 4 times in the past 2 weeks, the way she always ran numbers when the situation got desperate enough that she needed something solid to hold on to. The Callaway land was good land, or it had been, before Harold Callaway spent 8 years borrowing against it. The soil along the eastern field was still productive. The water rights to the creek were intact. There were 60 acres of timber on the North Ridge that nobody had properly assessed in 15 years. Ruth had assessed it. She'd assessed everything, quietly, in the early mornings when her father was still sleeping, and she could spread the geological survey maps across the kitchen table and read them the way other women read letters. The land was worth more than her father owed. It was worth considerably more. But Harold Callaway didn't know that, because Harold Callaway had never once asked his older daughter what she thought about anything that mattered. And Cornelius Vane, the railroad agent who'd been circling the county for 3 months with his cash offers and his polished shoes, absolutely knew it. Which was why he kept coming back. But that was a problem for another night. Tonight, a wagon was pulling into the yard. "Ruth!" Her father's voice snapped across the hallway. "Get back in the kitchen!" She got up from the settee. Clara reached out and caught her wrist, just for a moment, just long enough to say without words what she couldn't say out loud. Ruth squeezed her sister's hand and let go. She was back in the kitchen doorway when she heard the knock. 3 solid blows against the front door. The knock of a man who expected it to open. Her father opened it. "Mr. Weston," the warmth in Harold's voice was the particular warmth of a desperate man. Come in, come in. Terrible night for riding." "Nights don't bother me much." The voice that answered was low and unhurried, with a flatness to it that wasn't unfriendly so much as precise. A voice that had stopped wasting words a long time ago. "Harold Callaway?" "The very same. Please, come in. We've got a fire going. My daughter Clara will bring coffee. Clara, sweetheart, the coffee." "In a moment, Father," Clara said, perfectly composed, perfectly timed. Ruth stayed where she was. She could hear the man moving through the front room. Measured steps, not rushed. The particular gait of someone who was taking in every detail of a space, without appearing to look at anything. She'd seen that walk before, once, in Laramie, on a man who'd introduced himself as a railroad investigator. She hadn't liked that man. She pressed herself a little further back into the shadow of the doorway and waited. "Mr. Weston," her father was saying, with the salesman's cadence he used when he was most frightened. "May I introduce my daughter Clara? She's 21 years old, educated at the convent school in Denver, accomplished in household management and—" "Miss Callaway," the flat voice again, with a brief pause that suggested a nod rather than a bow. "You look well." "Thank you, Mr. Weston." Clara, composed as winter glass. "Won't you sit down?" There was the sound of a chair, the clink of a coffee cup. Then silence long enough that Ruth began counting seconds. "You have another daughter," Elias Weston said. The silence that followed was a different kind. Yes, Harold said. "Ruth. She helps with the household. She's not— I'd like to meet her." "Mr. Weston, I assure you that Clara is the— I'd like to meet her." Not louder, not harder. Just the second time. Flat and certain. Like a man who didn't ask for things twice, for reasons of courtesy, but simply because the first time had been sufficient. Ruth stepped out of the doorway. She was still holding the dish towel. She'd forgotten it was in her hands. She set it on the hallway table and walked into the front room and looked at Elias Weston for the first time. He was not what she'd expected, though she couldn't have said precisely what she had expected. He was tall, broad through the shoulder, maybe 38 or 40. His coat was plain dark wool, good quality, worn without vanity. His hair was dark, going silver at the temples. His hands, resting on his knees as he sat, were the hands of a man who worked for a living. Knuckled, calloused, honest in the way that only hands that have done real labor ever are. His eyes were brown and very direct, and they were looking at her the way a man looks at a piece of land he is genuinely trying to understand. Not to possess, but to assess. It was not a comfortable feeling. "Ruth Callaway," she said, because no one was going to introduce her properly, and she was not going to stand there waiting to be described. "I'm Harold's older daughter." Elias Weston. He didn't stand, which surprised her, but then she saw that it wasn't rudeness. He was waiting to see what she would do with a room that wasn't making space for her. She crossed it and sat down in the straight-back chair across from him. Her father made a sound somewhere between a cough and a strangled protest. "Your father tells me he has land and a daughter willing to head west," Elias said. He addressed it to both of them, or to the room, or to the fireplace. His tone didn't assign it to anyone in particular. "I came because I'm looking for a wife. I run 2,800 acres in Wyoming Territory, east of Laramie. I've got 18 head of working horses, 240 cattle, 6 hands, and a house that needs more than what one man can maintain." "That's a considerable operation," Ruth said. "It is, which is why I need someone capable of managing it, not someone I have to manage in addition to everything else." His eyes settled on her, briefly. "What do you do here, Miss Callaway?" Her father opened his mouth. Ruth answered before he could. "I manage the property accounts. I maintain the equipment inventory, coordinate the field schedules, and handle all correspondence with creditors and suppliers." She paused, measuring how much honesty the room could hold. "I also survey the land when we need an accurate assessment, and I handle veterinary care for the livestock." Elias Weston said nothing. He was looking at her with the same quality of attention he'd given the room when he walked in, methodical and thorough. "Ruth has a great many practical skills," her father said, in a tone that made practical skills sound mildly embarrassing. "Clara, of course, brings a more refined sort of—" "Can you read a geological survey map?" Elias asked. The question was directed at Clara. Clara, to her credit, answered honestly. "No, Mr. Weston, I was not educated in that." "Can you assess the mineral and water rights on a contested parcel?" "No, sir." "Can you read a contract for land purchase and identify where the numbers don't match the stated terms?" Clara's chin came up slightly. "I understand that those are not skills I possess. I was educated to manage a household, to—" "Who taught you to survey?" He turned back to Ruth. "A man named Garrett. He was contracted to do an assessment of the North Ridge when I was 14. He let me follow him for 3 days. I borrowed his equipment manuals afterward and taught myself the rest." "Does your father know you can do that?" Ruth looked at her father. Harold Callaway was the color of old ash, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man discovering that someone had been living in his house all this time without his knowledge. "No," Ruth said. "He doesn't." "Why not?" "Because he never asked." The fire crackled. Outside, the November wind pushed against the windows. Elias Weston set down his coffee cup. He looked at Harold Callaway with the same flat attention he'd turned on everything else in the room. "You were offering me the younger one. Clara is the appropriate—" "Why?" She's educated. She's accomplished. She can't run a working ranch." "Not cruel, simply factual. The way a doctor names a condition." "Can she?" Harold's jaw worked. "She can learn." "I'm not buying a student, Mr. Callaway. I've got $18,000 of livestock and equipment and 6 men depending on decisions being made correctly. I need someone who already knows how to work." He picked up his hat from where he'd laid it across his knee, turned it once in his hands. "I'll stay 2 days. I want to see the property, understand the operation, understand what I'm walking into." His eyes went to Ruth, then to Clara, then back to Harold. "And I'll make my own choice about which daughter understands what I'm actually offering." Harold stood up. "Mr. Weston, I must insist. You can insist all you like." For the first time, a slight hardness entered that flat voice. The hardness of a man who had once worked for the Pinkerton National Detective Agency and had spent 7 years being very patient with people who thought their opinion of a situation changed the facts of it. "The arrangement your letter described was that you provide the option and I make the selection. If that's no longer the arrangement, say so now, and I'll ride back to Laramie tonight, and you can explain to the Cattlemen's Bank in March why you thought my conditions were unreasonable." Harold sat back down. Clara was looking at her hands. Ruth was looking at Elias Weston, and Elias Weston was looking at Ruth. And in that moment, some kind of understanding passed between them that neither of them had words for yet. The understanding of two people who have each, in their separate lives, grown so accustomed to doing what needed doing without being thanked for it, that the mere fact of being seen by someone else doing the same thing felt like something close to recognition. "I'll show you to the barn," Ruth said, and stood up. "Your horse needs attention after that road." "I can manage my own horse, Miss Callaway." "I'm sure you can, but the south stall has a loose board that'll spook him if you don't know about it. I'll show you." She walked out of the room without waiting to see if her father would stop her. He didn't. He didn't have the right words yet, and Harold Callaway, whatever his many failures, had always understood that he needed the right words before he swung. The cold hit her the moment she stepped off the porch, and she pulled her coat tight and crossed the yard without looking back to see if Elias was following. She heard his boots on the frost-hardened ground a few steps behind her. She opened the barn door and held up the lantern and showed him which stall was safe and which board was loose. And she did it without ceremony, the way she did everything. And when she turned around, he was watching her with the same assessing look. "How long have you been running this property?" he asked. "Since I was 16, after my mother died." "And before that?" "Before that, I helped her run it." She set the lantern on the post and began checking the water in the trough with the back of her hand, not because she needed to, but because standing still while someone studied her had never been something she'd learned to do comfortably. "My father was better before she died, or perhaps he just hid it better. I'm not entirely certain which." "That's an honest thing to say about your own father." "You asked me yesterday to sell you an honest picture of this property. I assumed that extended to the people on it." "Yesterday?" He was checking his horse's hooves now, efficient and unhurried. The motions of someone who'd done it 10,000 times. "We met 20 minutes ago." "Your letter," Ruth said. "My father asked me to draft the response because his handwriting was illegible. I read your original inquiry." She paused. "You said you wanted the truth of the operation, not the promotion of it." He went still for a moment. Then he looked up at her from where he was crouched beside the horse. "You wrote the response letter," he said. "Yes." "Did you write it the way your father dictated it?" Ruth held his gaze. "I wrote it accurately." "Did he read it before it went out?" "He trusted me to handle correspondence. He generally doesn't read what I've sent until something goes wrong with it." Elias Weston stood up slowly and leaned against the stall door and looked at her for a long moment without saying anything. Then he said, "There were two things in that letter that made me make the trip. The land assessment figures and the yield projections for the north acreage. They were precise in a way that most men's land descriptions aren't." "Because most men estimate," Ruth said. "I measured." "You wrote those numbers yourself?" "Yes." "Does your father know the North Ridge is worth twice what he thinks it is?" The cold in the barn was deep and specific, the cold of late November settling into wood and stone and hay. Ruth could see her breath. She thought about Cornelius Vane and his polished shoes and his offer of 40 cents on the dollar for land she knew was worth 4 times that. She thought about the 3 visits he'd made in the past 2 months, and the way her father had nearly shaken the man's hand twice, and both times Ruth had found a reason to interrupt. "No," she said, "he doesn't." "Why haven't you told him?" "Because the last time I told my father something he didn't want to hear about the property, he sold the east field to cover a card debt before I could prove the drainage improvement would double its yield." She kept her voice even. She'd had years of practice keeping her voice even. He acts on information faster than I can protect the outcome. So I stopped giving him information I couldn't afford to have acted on incorrectly. Elias Weston looked at her for a long time. "You've been managing this land," he said slowly, "around your father." "I've been managing this land." She picked up a lantern. "My father lives here. That's not the same thing." She walked back to the barn door and stopped with her hand on it. "Mr. Weston," she said, without turning around, "my sister Clara is a good woman. She's kind and she's careful, and she doesn't deserve to be sent somewhere that will break her. She was not built for the life you're describing, and she knows it, even if she won't say it, because she's been told her whole life that her beauty is her only useful quality, and so refusing this would feel like admitting she has no useful qualities at all." Ruth's hand tightened on the door frame. "That is my father's failure, not hers. I need you to understand that before you make any decisions." She stepped out into the cold. Behind her, after a moment, she heard Elias Weston say, very quietly, to no one in particular, "I'll be damned." She was halfway across the yard when she heard her father's voice from the porch, low and controlled, which was how she knew he was most dangerous. "Get inside, Ruth. Now." She climbed the porch steps. She could see in his face everything that was coming. The controlled rage, the calculations running behind his eyes, the way he was already deciding which parts of what had just happened were her fault. "In the kitchen," he said. "Don't come out until I call you." "Father," I said, "in the kitchen." She went, but she did not, as she had done her entire life, disappear into it. She stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the barn and watched the yellow square of lantern light inside it, where Elias Weston was settling his horse for the night in someone else's barn, on someone else's failing land, making calculations of his own. Ruth did not know what was coming next. She had grown up in a house where not knowing what was coming next was the permanent condition, and she had learned to work within it, around it, despite it. She'd built everything she'd accomplished by being the only person in a room willing to see the thing clearly. Elias Weston had looked at the wrong daughter tonight. He had looked at her the way she looked at a geological survey map. Not for beauty, not for comfort, but for what was actually there. She didn't know yet if that would save them or ruin everything. From the front room, she could hear her father's voice beginning its work on Clara, low and coaxing and remorseless, and Clara's soft, careful answers, and the particular silence of a young woman learning that her options had always been smaller than she'd been told. Violet stirred upstairs. A small sound, half-waked, quickly stilled. Ruth filled the kettle and set it on the stove and told herself the same thing she'd been telling herself for 10 years. Stay steady. See clearly. Do the work. Whatever Elias Weston decided in the next 2 days, Ruth Calloway was going to make sure he decided it with the truth in front of him. She owed Clara that much. She owed herself that much. She owed Violet everything else. The kettle had gone cold by the time Ruth heard her father's footsteps on the stairs. She didn't move from the kitchen table where she'd been sitting with the household ledger open in front of her, though she hadn't turned a page in 40 minutes. She listened to the particular rhythm of his steps, the heavy fall of a man who'd been drinking just enough to feel righteous, but not enough to lose his precision. And she set her pen down carefully and waited. Harold Callaway walked into the kitchen and stood at the end of the table and looked at his older daughter the way he looked at the north fence when it needed repairing. Like a problem he resented having to address. "You embarrassed this family tonight," he said. Ruth folded her hands on top of the ledger. "I answered a man's questions honestly. You made your sister look inadequate." Clara made herself look like exactly what she is, an educated, capable woman who was not raised for frontier ranching. That's not inadequacy. That's just the truth. The truth. His voice had the particular quiet of a man holding something back with both hands. You want to talk to me about truth, Ruth? All right. The truth is that I have spent 23 years providing for this family. The truth is that I am the one who has borne the weight of every bad season and every bank notice and every... The truth, Ruth said quietly, is that you owe $4,200 to the Cattleman's Bank, $700 to Hennessy's Supply in Laramie, and $260 to Dr. Marsh for Violet's treatment through August. The truth is that the payment grace period ends in March, and we have no mechanism to meet it unless something changes. She looked at him steadily. I've known those numbers for 6 months. I've been trying to find a way to solve the problem that doesn't involve selling Clara to a stranger. The muscle in Harold's jaw worked. Elias Weston is not a stranger. He's a man of means with a legitimate... He's a man we met 3 hours ago. Who can save this family? Who can save your debts? Ruth corrected. And the distinction was important enough that she let it sit there between them, without softening it. Her father's hand came down flat on the table. Not a blow. A controlled impact. The kind that said, I am deciding not to do the other thing. Ruth had learned to read the gradations of that decision over many years. Tomorrow, Harold said, Mr. Weston will be shown around the property. Clara will accompany him. You will remain at the house and manage your sister's absence from the kitchen. You will be polite, you will be invisible, and you will not volunteer information, opinions, or assessments of any kind. He straightened. Do I make myself clear? Perfectly. Good. He picked up the lamp from the counter. And Ruth, if you interfere with this arrangement, if you do what you did in that barn again, if you put yourself between me and the one decent option this family has left, I will not forget it. He left. His footsteps climbed the stairs and crossed the ceiling overhead and stopped. Ruth sat at the table in the dark for a while. Then she opened the ledger to the page she'd bookmarked with a strip of folded paper and looked at the numbers she'd been looking at for 6 months. The real numbers. The ones that told a different story than the one her father kept telling himself. The Northridge timber alone, properly assessed and sold at market rate, would clear the bank debt and leave surplus. The creek water rights, if registered correctly before the railroad's land agents pushed through their easement petition in the spring, were worth more than the entire remaining property. These were not complicated conclusions. They required only the ability to read a survey map and a railroad commission filing, which Ruth could do, and the willingness to pursue them through the Territorial Land Office, which required a man's signature on the application, because that was the world they lived in. She needed a man willing to file on her behalf and capable of understanding what he was filing. She closed the ledger. Upstairs, she could hear Violet shifting in her bed, the small sounds of a restless night. Ruth climbed the back stairs quietly, pushed open her sister's door, and found Violet awake, propped against her pillow, with the quilt pulled to her chin. I heard Father, Violet said. She was 19 and had their mother's dark eyes and a mind like a steel trap that nobody had ever properly valued because it existed in a body that couldn't ride a horse or work a field, and Harold Callaway had never learned to value anything he couldn't put to visible work. How bad was it? Manageable. Ruth sat on the edge of the bed. How's the leg? Same. Which meant bad. But Violet had stopped elaborating because elaborating distressed people, and Violet found other people's distress inefficient. Tell me about the man. Ruth told her. She left nothing out, because there was no point leaving things out with Violet, who had a way of identifying gaps in a story the way Ruth identified gaps in a survey line. Precisely, and without mercy. Violet listened without interrupting. When Ruth finished, Violet was quiet for a moment. "He asked you about the survey work," Violet said. "Yes." "Before he asked Clara anything else?" "Yes." "Because he'd read the letter." "That's what he said." Violet pulled the quilt tighter. The November cold was particularly cruel to the damaged nerves in her leg, and she managed it by going very still and very internal, a coping mechanism she developed at 12 and never had reason to abandon. "Ruth, he came here because of what you wrote, not because of what Father promised." Ruth didn't answer. "He doesn't want Clara. He hasn't made any decision yet. He asked for you by name before he'd been in the house 5 minutes." Violet's voice was patient, the way it was patient when she was being careful with someone she loved. "He asked what you do. He went to the barn to watch you work. He said—" "I know what he said." "Then what are you afraid of?" Ruth stood up. She went to the window and looked out at the cold black yard and the darker shape of the barn, where a lantern had finally gone out. "I'm afraid of what happens to you if this doesn't go the way it looks like it might go. I'm afraid of what Father does to this family when he loses control of the situation. I'm afraid of being wrong about a man I've known for 3 hours." She turned around. "I'm afraid of wanting something and being mistaken about whether I'm allowed to have it." Violet looked at her steadily. "You've been doing everything for everyone in this house for 10 years, and you've never once done something purely because you wanted it for yourself." "That's not—" "Name one thing, Ruth, one decision you made in the last 5 years that was purely yours." Ruth opened her mouth and closed it. "Go to sleep," Violet said, not unkindly. "Tomorrow's going to matter. You need to be clear-headed." Ruth pulled the quilt straighter at the foot of her sister's bed, an old habit, and went to her own room and lay awake, until the cold in the walls stopped feeling like a warning and started feeling like just cold. She was in the kitchen before first light. She heard Elias Weston come in from the barn at 6:30, the particular sound of a man scraping frost from his boots on the porch step, a sound that told her he'd been up for some time and hadn't bothered anyone about it. She had coffee on the stove. She poured a cup without ceremony and set it on the kitchen table and went back to the biscuits she was making. He came in. He looked at the coffee, then at her, then sat down. They were quiet for a while. It was not an uncomfortable quiet. It was the quiet of two people who had both spent significant portions of their lives in early mornings doing work that needed doing before anyone else was awake to comment on it. "Your father know you're down here?" he asked. "My father never knows I'm down here. That's how the meals appear." She cut the biscuits with the rim of a tin cup, the way her mother had taught her, quick and even. "He assumes the kitchen manages itself." Elias wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "What time did you go to sleep?" "Late enough." She didn't ask why he was asking. "Did you sleep?" "Some." He paused. "I've been thinking about what you said, about the North Ridge." Ruth set the biscuit pan down and turned to face him. Whatever conversation was about to happen, she was not going to have it with her back turned. "The timber value," he said. "You said your father doesn't know what it's worth, but you do." "Yes." "And the water rights." "Yes." "How long have you known?" "I completed the assessment 14 months ago." She crossed her arms, not defensively, but because the kitchen was cold and she was in her work clothes. "The creek comes off federal land. The prior appropriation rights were filed by my grandfather in 1851 and never formally transferred. There's a window in the Territorial Water Code, about 6 months wide, closing in April, where those rights can be properly registered and protected before the railroad's easement petition supersedes them." Elias set down the coffee cup. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't fully categorize. Not surprise exactly, because he didn't seem like a man who's surprised easily, but something adjacent to it. A recalibration. "You've been sitting on this for 14 months?" he said. "I've been trying to find a way to act on it." She held his gaze. "The land office in Laramie requires a property owner or his authorized agent to file the registration. My father is the property owner. I am not authorized. Every time I've tried to explain the situation to him, he either doesn't follow the technical details or he goes to Cornelius Vane to ask his opinion. And Vane tells him the water rights are a complicated legal matter best left alone. Because Vane wants them. Because Vane wants the land. The water rights are part of what makes it worth what it's worth." She watched him process this. "Vane's been offering my father 38 cents on the dollar for the full property. Father's almost taken the offer twice. Both times, I found a reason to delay." "What kind of reason?" "The first time I told him the south fence line was in dispute with the Hendricks property, and any sale would be complicated by the litigation. There was no litigation. I invented it, and then resolved it 3 weeks later when Father had forgotten about Vane's offer." She paused. "The second time, I told him I'd found a surveyor's error in the eastern boundary description that could void the title. That one was real. It took me 6 weeks to correct through the county recorder's office." Elias Weston stared at her. "You've been defending this land," he said slowly, "from your own father." "I've been defending it from my father's worst impulses," Ruth said. "That's not the same thing. He built something here once. He's lost the ability to see it clearly. And men like Vane are very good at finding men who've lost the ability to see clearly." "How do you know about Vane?" "I read his correspondence. Father leaves it on the kitchen table. Vane's a senior acquisitions agent for the Continental Land Improvement Company, a holding entity established 18 months ago in Denver to acquire land parcels along the proposed northern Wyoming rail extension. He's not buying farms, Mr. Weston. He's building a corridor." She reached past him to the shelf above the table and pulled down a folded paper. "The proposed rail line runs approximately 4 miles north of this property, which means the timber rights and the water access he wants aren't for the railroad. They're for a settlement development. Town lots. He'll resell at 10 times what he pays my father." She set the paper on the table in front of him. It was a copy, her copy, made from Vane's original at 2 in the morning 3 weeks ago, of the Continental Land Improvement Company's acquisition map for the county. Elias unfolded it. He looked at it for a long time. "Where did you get this?" he said. It wasn't quite a question. "Vane left his satchel in the front room on his second visit while my father showed him the property. I had 40 minutes. She picked up the biscuit pan again. "I copied what I needed." He looked up from the map. Something had shifted in his expression. The assessing look was still there, but it had deepened into something else, something that had its own quality of intensity. "Miss Callaway," he said, "what exactly do you want out of this situation?" She put the biscuit pan in the oven. She took her time closing the door. Then she turned around and gave him the truth she'd been deciding whether to give him since he sat down. "I want Violet's medical expenses covered through next spring. I want the bank debt cleared so my father can't be pressured into selling to Vane under duress. And I want the water rights filed correctly before April, so that whoever ends up with this property, my father, you, anyone, can't have them stripped by a railroad company acting through a shell corporation." She met his eyes. "That's what I want. The rest of it, what you decide about who you came here to choose, what my father decides to do after you leave. I can't control any of that, and I've stopped trying." The silence in the kitchen was of the particular quality that follows honesty that costs something. Elias picked up the map, folded it, set it down again. "The water rights filing. Could you do it yourself if someone authorized you?" "I know the process completely. If I filed an authorization at the land office in Laramie, a limited power of attorney for the registration only, Would you be able to execute it without your father's involvement? Ruth went very still. That would require you to have standing in the matter. You'd need to be a party to the property in some capacity. I'm aware of that. You've been here less than 12 hours. I'm aware of that too. He stood, folding the map into his coat pocket, with the matter-of-fact ease of a man pocketing something he intended to use. I was a Pinkerton for 7 years, mostly land fraud and railroad contract disputes. I've seen what Vane's type does to families who don't see them coming. His jaw set in a line that was not anger so much as the controlled counterpart of it. I walked away from that work because I spent 7 years being the instrument of exactly the kind of taking he's planning, and I made a decision that I was done being useful to men like that. Ruth looked at him. You told me last night you needed a capable partner for a working ranch. That's true. You didn't mention anything about land fraud litigation and water rights filings. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. It was not quite a smile, but it was in the territory. The ranch is real, Miss Callaway. Everything I told your father is accurate. I do need what I said I need. He looked at her directly. I just wasn't expecting to find someone who also needed precisely the kind of work I happen to know how to do. Overhead, Ruth heard her father's bedroom door open. She heard Clara's door a moment after, and then the soft, dragging step that was Violet, navigating the hallway on her bad leg, rather than waking anyone to help her. 2 days, Ruth said quietly. 2 days, Elias agreed. She turned back to the stove. Outside, the November sun was pulling itself over the ridge. Cold light, thin light, the kind that made everything look stripped back to its essentials. Ruth had always found something honest about that kind of morning. Nothing was hidden. Everything was exactly what it was. She heard Violet reach the top of the stairs, heard her begin the slow, careful descent, and she went to the hallway to meet her sister halfway. Behind her, she heard Elias Weston pick up his coffee cup again. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing else that needed saying right now, and they had both learned, in their separate lives and for their separate reasons, that words used before they were necessary were words wasted. The house was waking up around them, and there were 2 days left, and Ruth Calloway had spent her entire life making 2 days count. Cornelius Vane arrived at 10:30 in the morning, which told Ruth everything she needed to know about the kind of man he was. Late enough to suggest he had better things to do, early enough to catch the household before it had fully organized itself against him. She heard the horse before she saw him, and she was at the kitchen window when he rode into the yard, dismounting with the careful movements of a man who considered his trousers too expensive to risk against saddle leather. He was heavy-set and prosperous-looking, with a beaver felt hat that belonged in Denver and had no business on a working property in November, and he moved toward the front porch with the particular confidence of someone accustomed to doors opening before he knocked. Ruth dried her hands and walked to the front room. Her father was already there, having seen Vane from the upstairs window, and he was in the process of composing his face into the expression he used for people he both needed and resented. Clara sat near the window with her mending, and Violet had stationed herself in the straight-backed chair near the hallway, with a book open in her lap, which meant she was not reading, but listening. Elias Weston was nowhere in the room. He'd ridden out an hour ago with Ruth's hand-drawn map of the North Ridge, asking no questions and offering no explanation, and Harold had watched him go with the tight-lipped expression of a man who wanted to demand an accounting and had calculated that he could not afford to. "Mr. Vane," Harold said, opening the door before the knock. "This is unexpected." "I was passing through." Vane removed his hat with practiced charm and produced a smile that had all the components of warmth without any of the actual warmth. "I heard you had a guest. Thought I'd pay my respects." His eyes moved through the room, with a quick professional inventory of a man who assessed property for a living, and they landed on Ruth with a slight pause that he covered immediately. Miss Callaway, Miss Clara, and a fractional hesitation at Violet. The younger Miss Callaway, I believe. Mr. Vane, Ruth said. Violet said nothing. She turned a page she hadn't been reading. Please, sit down, Harold said. Ruth, coffee. In a moment. Ruth stayed where she was. Mr. Vane, what brings you out this direction? The Hendricks property is another 4 miles east. As I said, I was in the area. Vane settled into the armchair with the ease of a man sitting down in a room he already considered partly his. And I confess I was curious about your visitor. Elias Weston isn't a name one hears without taking note. He ran a considerable Pinkerton operation out of Cheyenne for several years, left under circumstances that were, well, he spread his hands in a gesture of diplomatic vagueness. Circumstances. Harold's attention sharpened. Ruth watched it happen and kept her own face entirely still. What circumstances? Harold asked. I wouldn't want to speak out of turn. Vane had the skill, Ruth had noticed in his previous visits, of implying things so cleanly that the implications seemed to arrive from the listener's own mind rather than his mouth. Only that a man who walks away from a position like that, in the middle of a contested land acquisition. Another diplomatic pause. One naturally wonders what he walked away from, and why, and whether his current interest in Wyoming Territory properties might be connected to his previous professional activities. The room was quiet enough that Ruth could hear Violet turn another page. You're suggesting, Ruth said, that Mr. Weston came here for reasons other than the ones he stated. Vane looked at her with something that wanted to be paternal and landed closer to predatory. I'm suggesting only that due diligence is a virtue, Miss Callaway, particularly when a stranger arrives unannounced and begins expressing interest in one's property. He was announced, Ruth said. My father invited him, specifically to discuss a property arrangement, which you know because my father told you about it on your last visit. She watched Vane's smile hold, but only barely. What I'm wondering, Mr. Vane, is what specifically prompted you to ride 4 miles out of your way this morning to discuss a man you claim only passing familiarity with. Harold made a sound. Ruth, it's a reasonable question, Violet said from her chair, without looking up from her book. Mr. Vane rode 4 miles to warn Father about a man he doesn't know well, on a morning when that man happened to be off the property. That's either very good timing or very deliberate timing. Vane looked at Violet with an expression he adjusted quickly. He had the instincts of a man who had learned to dismiss people in categories. Women who were useful to charm, and women who were not worth the effort. And Violet, with her bad leg and her quiet corner and her book, had apparently been filed in the second category. He was recalculating now. I came as a courtesy, he said, and for the first time the smoothness had a seam in it. Harold, I've made you a fair offer for this property. A generous offer, given the current state of... You've made him an offer of 38 cents on the dollar, Ruth said. The seam widened. The valuation is based on a professional... Whose professional assessment? Yours? Ruth crossed her arms. Mr. Vane, I've read the Continental Land Improvement Company's acquisition map for this county. I know where the proposed rail extension runs. I know what a quarter section of land with water rights and timber access within 6 miles of a rail terminus is worth on the current Denver land market. She held his gaze. 38 cents on the dollar is not a generous offer. It is an extraordinary insult, delivered to a man you calculated couldn't afford to refuse it. The room had gone absolutely still. Harold was looking at his daughter with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Not the familiar anger, not the familiar contempt, but something cracked open and uncertain. The expression of a man who has just discovered a room in his own house he didn't know existed. Vane set down his coffee cup with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence. Miss Callaway, I don't know where you've acquired this impression, but I assure you the Continental Land Improvement is a holding entity registered in Denver in March of last year, Ruth said, with 3 principal investors whose names appear on the Northern Wyoming Rail Extension preliminary route filing submitted to the Territorial Commission in August. The filing is public record. The acquisition map is not public record, but I've seen it. She didn't say how. She didn't need to. You've been buying land along that corridor for 14 months. You've acquired 11 properties. This one would give you unbroken water access from the Hendricks parcel all the way to the federal boundary, which is the single piece you need to make the development viable. Vane stood up. He did it slowly, which was more controlled, and therefore more dangerous than if he'd done it quickly. Harold, I'd like to speak with you. Privately. I think, said Elias Weston from the kitchen doorway, that anything you want to say to Mr. Callaway, you can say in front of his family. No one had heard him come in. Ruth had not heard the horse, had not heard the back door, had heard nothing. And she was a woman who had spent years listening for things. He stood in the doorway with his hat in one hand and his coat still on, and the particular stillness of someone who had been standing there long enough to have heard a significant portion of the conversation. His eyes found Vane and stayed there. Vane looked at him. Something passed between the 2 men that was not quite recognition and not quite hostility, but contained elements of both. The particular tension of 2 people who understand each other's methods because they have operated in the same world. Weston, Vane said. Vane. Elias came into the room and set his hat on the table, and sat down in the chair Ruth had vacated, settling into it with the unhurried ease of a man who had decided the room was his to occupy. It's been about 3 years. You were working the Laramie County acquisitions for the Denver Pacific Extension. I was working the fraud investigation on the same corridor. A pause. You were good at your job. As were you, Vane said carefully. Until you weren't. Until I decided I was done helping companies like yours strip working families of land they'd built their lives on. Yes. Elias's voice was entirely level. At which point, I bought 2,800 acres in Wyoming territory and started building something that was actually mine. He looked at Vane without anger, which was somehow worse than anger. What are you getting for this corridor, end to end? When they sell the town lots, I mean, not the acquisition price, the resale. Vane said nothing. Because my estimate, based on the Eastern Laramie precedent, would be somewhere between $40,000 and $60,000 in lot sales once the terminus is established. Which means you've been offering these families. Elias glanced at Harold, something careful in his expression. $2,000 or $3,000 for land that'll generate 20 times that inside of 5 years. Harold Callaway sat down heavily in his chair. He looked, Ruth thought, like a man who had been walking across what he believed was solid ground and had just looked down to discover it was ice, and the ice had been cracking for a very long time, and he was only now hearing the sound of it. Harold, Vane said, and the charm was back, recalibrated, directed with precision at the weakest point in the room. These are complicated matters. Land valuation, rail development, territorial commission filings. These aren't things a man should try to navigate without experienced guidance. My offer stands. It is a fair offer for what this property is today, not for what someone might speculate it could be worth under hypothetical, the water rights registration, Ruth said. How long have you known about the filing window? Vane looked at her. The prior appropriation rights filed in 1851, she continued. The 6-month window in the Territorial Water Code, where they can be properly registered before your easement petition supersedes them. How long have you known? The silence stretched out long enough to become its own answer. You came today, Ruth said, because someone told you Elias Weston was on this property, and you knew that a man with his background would understand exactly what those water rights are worth, and you needed to neutralize his influence before he could explain it to my father. She watched Vane's face. That's why the timing. That's why today. Clara, who had not spoken since Vane walked in, set down her mending with a small, deliberate sound. Mr. Vane, she said, in the particular voice she used when she had decided something, clear and final, like a door closing. I think you should leave. Vane looked at Clara, the beautiful daughter, the one he'd assessed as the soft target, the one whose presence in the room he'd been counting on to keep the emotional temperature manageable. And something in this calculation visibly failed. Harold, he began. My daughter asked you to leave, Harold said. His voice was odd, stripped of its usual performance, quieter than Ruth had heard it in years. He was looking at the middle distance, somewhere past Vane's shoulder, with the expression of a man doing arithmetic he didn't like the answer to. I think you should. Vane picked up his hat. He did not rush. Rushing would have conceded too much. He moved toward the door with the measured pace of a man who was not defeated, only temporarily displaced, which was the most dangerous kind of man to have as an adversary, because he would simply find another angle and try again. At the door, he paused and looked back at Ruth with an expression that was not quite a threat. Too careful for that, too practiced, but that carried the full implication of one. Miss Callaway, you're a sharp woman. Sharp women in contested territory tend to make themselves conspicuous in ways that are not always to their advantage. I'll take my chances, Ruth said. He left. The room breathed. Harold put his face in his hands. It was not something Ruth had ever seen her father do. This complete, unguarded collapse of the posture he'd maintained for 20 years. And it was terrible and human. And she sat with the complicated feeling of watching someone you have both loved and resented become, for one unguarded moment, simply a person. $4,000, Harold said, into his hands. I nearly took $4,000. You didn't, Ruth said. Because of you. He looked up. His eyes were red at the edges, in the way of a man who was not going to cry, but was very close to the border of it. Because you... Ruth, how long have you... He stopped, reorganized, tried again. How long have you known about the water rights? 14 months. Why didn't you tell me? The question was so honest, so genuinely confused, that Ruth had to take a moment before she answered it. Because the answer was true, and it was going to hurt him, and she had spent so long protecting him from things that would hurt him that the habit was hard to break even now. Because the last time I brought you important information about this property, you made a decision before I could walk you through the implications. She kept her voice even. I needed to find a way to act on it that didn't depend on getting your agreement before I could explain the full picture. I was still working on that problem when Mr. Weston arrived. Harold looked at her for a long time. Then he looked at Elias, who had been sitting quietly through all of this, with the patience of a man who understood that some conversations needed to run their full length without intervention. You knew, Harold said to him. This morning when you rode out, you knew what she'd found. She showed me the map last night, Elias said, and told me about the water rights this morning. He paused. She's been protecting this land for you for over a year. Without your knowledge. Without your help. Without your thanks. Harold's jaw tightened. You don't need to tell me what my own daughter... I think maybe I do, Elias said, not unkindly. because you came very close to selling everything she's been protecting for $3,000 to a man who was going to make 40 times that off your water." The quiet that followed was different from the earlier quiets. It had weight and texture, and the particular quality of something that had been a long time coming and was finally, irrevocably, here. Violet had closed her book. She was watching her father with those dark, careful eyes. Not with anger. Violet rarely expressed anger, had learned early that it cost more than she could afford, but with the quiet attention of someone who had decided to be present for whatever happened next. Harold looked at Ruth. He looked at her the way he had not looked at her in years. Not through her, not past her, not at the problem she represented or the work she could perform, but at her, at the actual face of his older daughter, 24 years old, with her mother's jaw and her grandfather's stubbornness, and the calloused hands of someone who had been holding this family together long after anyone had given her reason to. "I owe you an apology," he said. The words came out rough and unpolished. The words of a man who did not say such things easily and was not going to dress them up into something more comfortable. "More than one. I owe you. Ruth, I have not—" He stopped again. "I've let you carry things that I should have been carrying." Ruth said nothing. She was not, she discovered, ready to make it easy for him. Not yet. Maybe not for a while. "We need to talk about what happens next," Elias said, into the silence that Ruth's non-response had created. "The water rights filing needs to happen before April. That's the immediate priority. Everything else, the bank debt, the property decision, what you do with the Northridge timber, those are secondary." He looked at Harold. "But the filing requires your authorization, Mr. Callaway. Your signature on a limited power of attorney, designating Ruth as your agent for the water rights registration. Without that, Vane's petition will supersede your claim, and you'll lose the most valuable asset on this property." Harold rubbed his face. The ash-gray look had not entirely left it. "And you want to file it?" "I want Ruth to file it," Elias said, "because she knows the process. She knows the documentation. And she's the one who's been protecting that right for 14 months. She should be the one who secures it." He paused. "I'll accompany her to the land office in Laramie. I still have contacts there from my Pinkerton years. I know which clerk is honest and which one Vane has in his pocket." Clara looked up from where she'd been sitting quiet. "When?" "Tomorrow morning," Elias said, "if your father signs tonight." Everyone looked at Harold. Ruth watched her father, this man she had loved and resented and protected and defied and carried, as he sat with the full weight of the moment pressing down on him and made, for perhaps the first time in years, a decision that was not driven by desperation or pride, but by something that might, if it survived the night, become clarity. "Get me the paper," Harold Callaway said. "I'll sign it tonight." Harold signed the paper at the kitchen table by lamplight, and Ruth witnessed it, and Elias witnessed it, and nobody said anything more than was necessary, because the document said everything that needed saying, and additional words would only have made Harold feel worse about how long it had taken to get here. After her father went upstairs, Ruth sat at the table with the signed authorization in front of her and read it 3 times. Not because she doubted its legality. She knew exactly what it needed to contain, and she had drafted it herself from the territorial statutes she'd been memorizing for 14 months. But because she needed to feel the reality of it. Paper in her hands. Words that meant something. A door that had been locked for over a year, and now wasn't. Elias was at the stove, heating what was left of the coffee. He set a cup in front of her without being asked. "We leave at first light," he said. "The land office opens at 8. I want to be there when it opens." The clerk you mentioned. The one Vane has in his pocket. Harlan Briggs. He handles intake for water rights filings specifically. Elias sat across from her. We go to James Whitfield instead. He's the chief recorder. Honest man. 20 years in the office. Doesn't take money from anyone because he's got enough of his own and enough pride not to need more. A pause. I did him a favor in 1874. He'll see us without an appointment. Ruth looked at him across the table. You plan to come to Laramie, regardless of what you decided about the property arrangement? It wasn't quite an accusation. He took it as a statement of fact, which was the accurate way to take it. I knew about Dane's operation before I came here, he said. Not this specific property, but the corridor, the pattern. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. When your father's letter arrived, your letter, and the survey numbers were precise enough that I could see someone on that property actually understood what they had, I thought it was worth the trip to find out who, and whether they needed help, before Vane finished what he was doing. Ruth absorbed this. So the wife arrangement is real, he said, directly and without qualification. I told your father the truth. I need a partner. The ranch is exactly what I described. That part of it has nothing to do with Vane, or the water rights, or any of this. He met her eyes. But I wasn't going to ride 2 days and not address the other problem, if the other problem was there. You could have addressed it without the marriage arrangement. I could have. He didn't look away. But then I wouldn't have had a reason to stay long enough to understand what I was actually dealing with. Ruth was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind had picked up and was working at the corner of the house, finding gaps in the chinking the way winter always did, looking for any weakness it could use. Elias, she said, and using his name still required a small internal adjustment, the word still new in her mouth. When we get back from Laramie, when the filing is done and the water rights are secured, she kept her voice level. Then what? He was quiet for long enough that she knew he'd been thinking about the same question. Then I tell you what I've been thinking since approximately the second time you opened your mouth in this house, he said. And you tell me whether any part of what I'm thinking matches what you want. And we go from there. He stood, picking up his cup. But tonight we sleep. Tomorrow we ride. She didn't sleep. Not much. She lay awake in the dark and listened to the wind, and went through the filing process step by step in her mind, the way she'd gone through it dozens of times in the past year. Every document, every requirement, every contingency. She was not afraid of the process. She had been prepared for the process for a long time. What she had not been prepared for was the feeling of doing it with someone beside her. They rode out before full light, the two of them on horseback, the authorization document in an oilskin case tucked inside Ruth's coat against her chest. The road to Laramie ran north and west through country that was wide and cold and indifferent in the way that only open land in November truly was. And they rode it mostly in silence, that was comfortable rather than strained. Two people who had discovered that they did not need to fill space with noise to tolerate each other's company. About an hour out, Elias said, "Tell me about Violet." Ruth glanced at him. "What about her? How long has the leg been bad?" "Since she was 9. She was thrown from a horse, a green-broke mare that father hadn't finished properly. The fall broke her leg in 2 places and damaged the nerves along the outside of the knee." Ruth kept her eyes on the road. "Dr. Marsh in Laramie has a treatment protocol, electrical stimulation, specific exercises, a brace he had made for her in Denver. It helps, but it requires consistent treatment, and the medication for the nerve pain is expensive." A pause. "When the money gets short, the medication is the first thing father cuts." Elias said nothing for a moment. "Does Violet know that?" Violet knows everything that happens in that house. She sits very quietly and reads books, and notices more than anyone gives her credit for. I noticed that, he said, in the front room this morning. She saw through Vane before anyone else spoke. She's been reading people since she was 9 years old, and discovered that she couldn't run away from them. Ruth said it without bitterness, just the flat fact of it. It makes you observant when your only option is to understand the situation rather than exit it. They rode on. The sky was lightening in the east, gray going to pale gold, the kind of morning that promised cold but delivered clarity. She could come to Wyoming, Elias said. Violet, if you came. There's room, and Dr. Marsh makes the ride to the ranches in the territory 4 times a year for patients who can't make the trip themselves. I've used him for my hands when they've been injured. He was looking straight ahead, his tone matter-of-fact, as if he were discussing a supply arrangement rather than turning Ruth's careful architecture of worry completely on its head. She wouldn't be a burden. She'd be useful. From what I've seen in the last 2 days, her mind is the sharpest thing in that household. Ruth did not say anything for a while. She didn't say anything because the thing that was happening in her chest was large and complicated, and she needed to be sure she had it correctly identified before she allowed it to affect her voice. It was not sentimentality. She was not a sentimental woman, had not had the luxury of being one. It was something more structural than that. The feeling of a load-bearing problem she'd been solving around for years, suddenly, unexpectedly, having a direct solution offered, and the specific kind of vertigo that came with that. "You've known her for 2 days," Ruth said finally. "I've known enough," he said, in the same tone he'd used to say, "I've known enough women to recognize substance." It was not a careless statement. It was a precise one. Ruth looked at the road ahead and did not trust herself to respond. Laramie was waking up when they rode in. The main street in the particular early morning state of a working town. The livery already busy, the blacksmith's fire going, the general store sweeping its porch. Elias rode with the ease of a man who knew this town and didn't need to look around to know where anything was. And Ruth rode beside him and watched the way people noted his presence. A nod from the man outside the assay office. A lifted hand from a woman crossing the street with a market basket. The small social signals of someone known and respected in a community. They stabled the horses and went directly to the Territorial Land Office on the north end of the main street. A 2-story stone building that looked exactly like what it was. A place with a permanent record of things was kept. Unglamorous and essential. The door was unlocked. A young clerk at the front desk looked up when they entered, and his eyes went to Elias, and then to Ruth, and then back to Elias, with a particular assessment of someone trying to determine what kind of transaction was about to take place. "James Whitfield," Elias said. "Tell him Elias Weston is here. He'll know the name." The clerk went. They waited. Ruth stood very still, with the oilskin case under her arm, and kept her breathing even and her expression neutral, and said nothing. A door at the back of the office opened, and a man came out, 60, spare and erect, with the careful movements of someone who'd spent decades handling documents he considered important. He looked at Elias with recognition and crossed the room and shook his hand with the brevity of 2 men who had established their mutual respect some time ago and didn't need to re-establish it. "Weston," Whitfield said. "It's been a while." 3 years. This is Ruth Calloway. She holds a power of attorney for Harold Callaway, property owner in the county southeast of here. We're here to file a prior appropriation water rights registration under the 1851 original claim." Whitfield looked at Ruth. He had the eyes of a man who had seen every variety of land transaction and every variety of person attempting one. And his assessment was thorough and unhurried. "Miss Callaway, do you have the documentation?" "Yes, sir." She opened the oilskin and laid the papers on his counter in the order she'd organized them. the original 1851 filing by her grandfather, the unbroken chain of property title, the power of attorney, and the registration application she'd prepared in its final form. Each document clean, correctly indexed, complete. Whitfield went through them in silence. He was slow and exact about it, the way an honest man handles important papers. And Ruth stood and watched him without fidgeting. "The 1851 document is original," Whitfield said. "Yes, sir. It's been in the family since it was filed." "The chain of title is unbroken." "Yes, sir. I traced it through the county recorder's records and had the gaps certified 6 months ago." Whitfield looked up at her over the papers. "You prepared this application yourself?" "Yes, sir." A pause. "It's correct," he said, and there was something in his voice that wasn't quite surprise, but was in the neighborhood of it. The sound of a man who had reviewed a great many improperly prepared filings and had not expected this one to be otherwise. "I'll need to review against the easement petition calendar. There's a filing from the Continental Land Improvement Company, submitted August 14th, Ruth said, under the Northern Wyoming Rail Extension preliminary petition. The prior appropriation claim takes precedence over a subsequent easement petition, under Territorial Water Code Section 12, Paragraph 4. The easement cannot supersede a registered prior claim, but it can supersede an unregistered one." Whitfield looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Elias. Then he looked back at the papers. "Give me 40 minutes, he said, and took the documents into the back office. They sat in the 2 chairs along the wall and waited. The young clerk at the front desk tried twice to appear as though he wasn't watching them, and failed both times. Ruth sat with her hands in her lap and her back straight and looked at the opposite wall and felt the 40 minutes pass with a particular quality of time that moved both too slowly and too quickly when something important was being decided. She was on the 35th minute by her internal count when the front door opened. Cornelius Vane walked in. He had not ridden hard. His clothes were unruffled, his hat at its usual angle, which meant he had either set out from the Callaway property very shortly after they had, or he had spent the night in Laramie, anticipating that this morning might happen. Ruth thought it was the latter. She thought he had been more prepared for yesterday's confrontation than he'd appeared, and that the apparent defeat had been tactical rather than real. He saw Ruth first, then Elias. His face did not change, which told her everything. "Miss Callaway," he said. "Mr. Weston. What a coincidence." "It isn't," Elias said. He had not moved from his chair, had not shifted his posture or changed his expression. He looked like a man who had been expecting this and had decided in advance to let it arrive without drama. Vane approached the front desk. "I have a filing to expedite," he said to the clerk. "Urgent addendum to the Continental Land Improvement Company easement petition. I need to speak with Mr. Briggs immediately." The clerk, who had been watching this play out with the expression of a man who deeply wished he worked somewhere else, said, "Mr. Briggs doesn't come in until 9, sir." "Then get me whoever is here." "Mr. Whitfield is here, sir, but he's currently—" The back office door opened. James Whitfield came out with the Callaway documents in his hand, and he looked at Vane the way a man looks at something he has been expecting to see show up and is faintly tired of. And he said, "Mr. Vane, I thought I might be seeing you today." "Whitfield." Vane's voice was measured. "I have an urgent addendum." "Your addendum doesn't change anything," Whitfield said. "The prior appropriation claim was filed in 1851, and the chain of title is unbroken. An addendum to a subsequent easement petition has no legal standing against a registered prior claim." He set the papers on the counter in front of Ruth. "Miss Callaway, your filing is accepted and registered. The certification number is on the top document. Your water rights are on record as of this morning." Ruth picked up the papers. Her hands were steady. She was proud of that. "This isn't finished," Vane said. He was still controlled, still precise, but the seam that had appeared yesterday had widened. "There are legal avenues." "There are always legal avenues," Elias said, standing now, unhurried, the way he did everything. "And you're welcome to pursue them. A registered prior appropriation claim against a subsequent easement petition, documented chain of title going back to 1851, filed and certified by the chief recorder. You'd be spending the Continental Land Improvement Company's money on a case a first-year territorial attorney could dismiss in an afternoon." He picked up his hat. "Or you could redirect your corridor 6 miles north, where the Henderson property has no water rights complications and an owner who actually wants to sell. Tom Henderson's been trying to retire for 2 years." A silence. Ruth watched Vane calculate. It was visible in the way his eyes moved, not left to right, but inward. The particular gaze of a man running numbers. 6 miles north changed the development geometry, but did not eliminate it. The Henderson property, if Vane knew its specifications, might serve adequately. The question was whether the fight for this corridor was worth what it would cost. "This isn't finished," Vane said again, but it was quieter the second time. The first time it had been a statement. The second time it was something a man says when he has already begun the process of accepting that it is. He left. The clerk let out a breath that he had clearly been holding for some time. Whitfield looked at Ruth. "Your grandfather knew what he was doing when he filed in 1851, he said. "And so did you." He extended his hand, a gesture he clearly did not make with everyone, and Ruth shook it. They rode back through the afternoon, the sun low and white over the western hills, the cold settling in the way it did when the wind dropped, and the temperature fell into the clean, mathematical cold of late November. The horses moved steadily, their breath visible in the air, and Ruth rode with the certified documents in the oilskin case against her chest, and felt the particular quiet of someone who had been carrying something heavy for a long time, and had finally set it down. She was aware of Elias riding beside her. She had been aware of him in the way you were aware of a landmark you'd been navigating by. Constantly, without looking directly. "He'll try the Henderson property," she said. "Probably. Henderson will take the offer and be glad of it. He's 72 and his son's moved to Denver." Elias glanced at her. "Your corridor's protected. Vane can build his development, just not on your water." Ruth nodded. The word "your" landed with a weight she was still learning to carry. "Elias," she said it without deciding to. "When you said, last night, that you'd tell me what you'd been thinking when we get back." "Yes." "We're getting back." He was quiet for a moment. The horses' hooves on the frozen road made a sound that was steady and unhurried, and indifferent to whatever was about to be said. "I came here thinking I needed a capable woman," he said. "Someone who understood work, who could manage a serious operation, who wouldn't fall apart when things got hard." He was looking straight ahead at the road. "I've spent 2 days watching you protect a piece of land that was never going to be given to you. Defend a family that has mostly failed you. Look out for a sister and a father who both needed looking after more than they understood. You did all of it without being asked, without being thanked, and without once stopping to ask whether you were allowed to want something for yourself." He paused. "I don't just need a capable woman, Ruth. I need you, specifically. And I think I knew that about 16 hours after I knocked on your father's door." The road stretched ahead of them, straight and cold and long. "I don't know how to be chosen," Ruth said. Not a protest, just the truth of it. "I know," he said. "I'm going to need you to learn." She looked at him then, full on, the way she hadn't let herself look at him since that first night in the barn, when she'd felt the weight of his attention and hadn't known what to do with it. He was looking back at her with those dark, direct eyes that didn't ask for anything she wasn't ready to give, but made it entirely clear that whatever she was ready to give, he would receive it with his whole attention. "The ranch," she said. "The 2,800 acres. And Violet's medical costs," he said. "And whatever it takes to sort your father out. And Cole Briggs, who's been my foreman for 6 years and will take one look at you and decide you're the best thing that's happened to the Weston operation since I bought the North Pasture." The corner of his mouth moved. "He's not easy to impress. You'll manage it by the end of the first week." Ruth looked back at the road. She thought about the water rights document against her chest, the weight of it, the simple, solid fact of something protected and permanent. She thought about Violet's dark eyes watching her from the straight-back chair, seeing everything. She thought about Clara, who deserved a different kind of life, and her father, who had looked at her last night with something cracked open and uncertain in his face. And she thought about what it meant to build something instead of simply preventing collapse. "Yes," she said. Elias didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "Yes to which part?" "All of it," Ruth said. "I'm saying yes to all of it." The horses moved on through the cold afternoon, and the land opened wide around them, and ahead, somewhere past the next ridge and the next, the Callaway property was waiting, with its protected water and its honest bones, and her father's uncertain new beginning, and her sister's quiet, fierce intelligence, and all the complicated, unfinished work of a family that had just barely, at the last possible moment, found its way to a different kind of reckoning. Ruth Calloway kept her eyes on the road ahead and let herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, simply feel the full weight of what it was to have made a choice that was entirely and completely her own. They arrived back at the Callaway property as the last light was leaving the sky, the kind of dark that came fast in November and left no gradual warning, just the sudden understanding that the day was finished. Clara was on the porch when they rode in. She had her shawl wrapped tight, and she was watching the road with a particular stillness of someone who had been waiting for a specific thing and was now confirming that it had arrived. When Ruth dismounted, she came down the steps and looked at her sister's face, and seemed to read everything she needed to know from it, without a word being exchanged. "It worked," Clara said. "It worked." Clara let out a breath that she had apparently been holding for several hours, and put her arms around Ruth, and held on with the fierce, specific grip of a younger sister who had spent most of her life watching her older sister carry things alone, and was only now understanding the full weight of what that had meant. Ruth held her back. She did not say everything was fine, because Clara didn't need that, and had in fact specifically asked her not to say it. She just held on, and let that be enough. Elias took both horses to the barn without being asked. Ruth noticed this, and filed it in the place where she was keeping all the things about him that she was still learning to trust. Inside, Violet was at the kitchen table with her leg propped on the second chair and the lamp turned up high, working through a column of figures on a sheet of paper that turned out, when Ruth looked over her shoulder, to be an independently derived calculation of the North Ridge timber value. She had arrived at a number that was within $40 of Ruth's own assessment. "You did that from memory," Ruth said. "I've been listening to you talk about that ridge for 2 years." Violet looked up. "Well?" Ruth set the oilskin case on the table and opened it and put the certified water rights registration in front of her sister. Violet looked at it for a long time. She touched the edge of the paper with one finger, carefully, the way she touched things she considered important. Then she looked up at Ruth with those dark eyes that missed nothing. And what was in them was not just relief, but something older than relief. The specific emotion of someone who has believed in a person for a very long time, and has just watched that belief confirmed by the world, rather than in spite of it. "Good," Violet said. That was all. but the way she said it made it the fullest word in the room. Harold Callaway was in the front room when Ruth came through. He was sitting in his chair by the fire, not drinking, not pacing, just sitting in the particular still way of a man who has done something uncomfortable and necessary, and is now waiting to see whether it meant what he hoped it meant. He looked up when Ruth came in. "Done?" he said. "Done and registered. The certification number's on the document. Vane has no legal standing against a prior claim on record." Harold nodded. His hands were on his knees, and he was looking at her in that new, uncertain way he developed in the last 24 hours. The way of a man learning a new language, and not yet sure he was pronouncing anything correctly. "Ruth," he said, "sit down a minute." She sat, because whatever was coming, she had decided she was going to let it arrive without making it harder for him than it needed to be. She had spent years being angry at her father, and the anger was not wrong, and she was not going to pretend it wasn't there. But she was also tired of carrying it as her primary weight, and the day had shifted something in her that she was still in the process of understanding. "I've been thinking," Harold said, "about the East Field. The drainage improvement you mentioned, 4 years ago." Ruth waited. "You said if we fixed the drainage, it would double the yield." He rubbed the back of his neck. "I sold that field before you could prove it." "Yes, to cover a car debt that I should not have had, and would not have had if I had been the kind of man I should have been for this family." He said it plainly, without the performance of remorse, just the flat acknowledgement of a fact. "I'm not going to sit here and tell you I've suddenly become that man. I'm not sure a man changes that completely at 52 years old." "I'm not asking you to change completely," Ruth said. "I'm asking you to let me do what I've been doing anyway, but without having to work around you while I do it." Harold looked at her. "That's a very specific kind of forgiveness." "It's the only kind I have right now. The other kind might come later. I'm not sure yet." He accepted this with a nod that was small and unadorned and somehow, because of its lack of drama, more genuine than anything more elaborate would have been. "The man, Weston." "Yes?" "He told me tonight, while you were upstairs. He told me that he's going to ask you to come to Wyoming, that he wants you for the ranch, as a partner." Harold paused on the word in a way that suggested he was still adjusting to its application. He was very clear about what he meant by partner, that you'd have authority and a share in the operation, and that he'd file a joint title on the water rights expansion when he purchases the Henderson Corridor property he mentioned. Ruth went still. "He said that?" "He said it. He also said—" Harold stopped, worked through something internal, continued. "He said that if I had any objection to my daughter being treated as the equal of the man she married, I should say so now, because after she left, it wouldn't be a conversation I was going to have an opportunity to revisit." His mouth moved in something that was not quite amusement, but was in its vicinity. "He's a blunt man." "Yes," Ruth said, "he is." "I told him I had no objection." Harold looked at the fire. "I told him that any objection I might have had, I'd forfeited a long time ago by not seeing what was in front of me." The fire crackled. Somewhere in the kitchen, Ruth could hear Violet and Clara talking low, the particular sound of sisters being private together, and it opened a small ache in her chest that she knew would not close cleanly when she left. "Violet," she said. "She needs—" "I know what she needs," Harold said, and the rawness in his voice was real and unperformed, and Ruth believed it. "I've been cutting the medication because I've been a coward about what it cost, and what that meant about the state of this family. I'm not going to do that anymore." He looked at her. "Weston offered to cover the medical costs through next spring. I told him it wasn't his obligation." "What did he say?" "He said it wasn't about obligation. He said—" He said the people Ruth loved were worth protecting. And that was the end of it as far as he was concerned. Harold was quiet for a moment. I didn't know how to answer that, so I didn't answer it. Ruth looked at her father for a long time, at the man he'd been and the man he was now trying to become, and at the long distance between those two things, and at the fact that she could not determine yet whether that distance would be crossed or not. But she could see him looking at it honestly, which was more than she'd been able to say a week ago, and that was something. "Father," she said, "whatever happens next, whatever you do with this property, with the timber, with the water rights, you have the tools now to not need Vane. You have a clean title and a protected water claim, and 14 months of my work to build on." She stood up. "Use it correctly this time." She left him with the fire and went upstairs to pack. She did not have much. She had never accumulated much, had learned early that possessions were weight you carried, and weight she'd had no surplus capacity for. A trunk, a canvas bag, her mother's sewing kit, which she had preserved through 7 years of steadily worsening household economics by the simple method of never letting anyone know where it was kept. The survey maps, rolled and tied with twine. The household ledgers from the past 4 years, which contained more institutional knowledge about the Callaway property than anything else in existence, and which she had decided, after brief consideration, to copy and leave the originals with Harold. Let him learn to read them. It was past time. Clara came in while she was packing and sat on the end of the bed and watched. "Tell me about the ranch," Clara said. Ruth told her, in the practical, specific way she understood things, the acreage, the operation, the house that needed what Elias had called a woman's hand, the hands who would test her first and follow her afterward, the Wyoming winter that would be harder than anything she'd experienced in her life, and which she intended to meet with the same basic approach she'd used for everything else, which was to understand it completely before it arrived, and then do the work. Clara listened with her chin on her hand and the look she had when she was genuinely absorbing something, rather than performing absorption. When Ruth finished, she said, "You're not afraid. I didn't say that. You didn't say you were either. And you talk about everything you're afraid of. You just describe it the same way you describe everything else, all the facts. But it's there, between the facts." Clara tilted her head. "You're afraid of trusting him." Ruth folded a blouse and set it in the trunk. "I'm afraid of trusting anyone." "You trust Violet." "Violet has never given me a reason not to." "Has he?" Ruth thought about the authorization he'd filed, the Henderson corridor suggestion that had given Vane a face-saving exit, rather than backing a dangerous man into a corner with nothing to lose. The way he'd said the people Ruth loved were worth protecting to her father, with no audience and no reason to perform it. The way he'd waited for her answer in the kitchen last night, with that particular patience of someone who had decided the truth was worth waiting for, however long it took to arrive. "Not yet," she said. "That's not the same as never." "No," Ruth agreed. "It isn't." Clara reached into her skirt pocket and produced a small object that Ruth recognized before she fully processed what she was seeing. Their mother's locket, the gold one with the enamel forget-me-nots that had gone to Clara when their mother died, because Clara was the one who'd been in the room, and Ruth had been in the barn, and grief had sorted itself out according to who was where. "Take it," Clara said. Ruth looked at her sister. "Clara, I've been carrying it for 8 years because I felt guilty that you weren't there when she died." Clara held it out. "I want you to take it because you should have had it all along, and because I want you to have something of her with you when you go somewhere she never got to see." Her voice was steady and deliberate. "She would have wanted you to go, Ruth. She would have wanted this for you. You know that." Ruth took the locket. It was warm from Clara's pocket. She closed her hand around it and held it for a moment and did not say anything because what she felt was too large and too specific for the general vocabulary of ordinary speech. She put the locket in her coat pocket, against her chest, next to the spot where the oilskin case had been all day. "What will you do?" Ruth asked. "After." Clara straightened. In the past 2 days, she had done something. Ruth had watched it happen, without being able to name it exactly. Some version of what Ruth herself had been doing. The process of removing a performance and finding out who was under it. She looked different for it. More herself, whatever that meant. And it was clearly still a self in the process of being discovered. "I'm going to stop practicing for a life someone else designed," Clara said. "I'm 21 years old, and I've been preparing to be useful to a husband since I was 12. I would like to spend a year being useful to myself instead, and see what I find out." A small pause. "And I'm going to look after Father. Not the way you did it, the way I can do it. Which means being honest with him, rather than working around him. Which is something I should have been doing for years, and didn't, because it was easier to let you be the difficult one." Ruth looked at her sister and felt something settle between them that had been off balance for a very long time. "You were never not enough," Ruth said. "I need you to know that. Whatever Father made you believe about your value being conditional on being chosen, that was his failure, not a fact." Clara's composure wavered, briefly and completely, and she pulled Ruth into another embrace that was fiercer than the one on the porch, and held on. And Ruth felt the full, specific weight of what it meant to leave the only person who had always, even imperfectly, even inadequately, been on her side. They stood there until they both recovered themselves. Then Clara wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and said, with the deliberate briskness of a woman resuming her composure by choice rather than necessity, "I'm going to check on Violet. You should finish packing." Ruth finished packing. She was carrying the trunk down the stairs when Elias appeared at the bottom and took it from her without ceremony, the way he did everything practical, as though the right thing to do in a given moment was simply the obvious thing and required no discussion. He carried it out to the wagon he'd arranged with the neighbor's son for the morning departure, and came back in and found Ruth in the hallway, standing with her canvas bag and her coat, and the feeling of a woman who has completed one kind of life and is standing at the edge of the next one. "Ready?" he said. "Almost." She looked at him. "You told my father you'd file a joint title on the water rights expansion." "When I purchased the Henderson property, yes." "You found the value in the corridor. You know the water law better than anyone in this county. That work deserves to be on record." He held her gaze. "Everything we build from here gets built together. That was what I meant by partnership. I meant it exactly." Ruth looked at this man who had ridden 2 days through November cold on the basis of a letter she had written, and who had walked into a room and seen her before he had been introduced to her, and who was standing in her father's hallway with the particular patience of someone who understood that the most important things were worth waiting for. "I don't know how to need help," she said. It cost her something to say it. She said it anyway. "I know," he said. "I didn't either for a long time. I learned." He offered his hand, not romantically, not with drama, but with the straightforward solidity of someone extending a working partnership and meaning every inch of it. "We'll figure out the rest as we go." She took his hand. In the morning, they left before the sun was fully up, the wagon loaded, the horses breathing white into the cold air. Harold stood on the porch, with Clara beside him and Violet at the railing, with her brace visible below her skirt hem and her dark eyes holding everything she was too practical to say out loud. Ruth sat on the wagon seat and looked at her family against the gray early light. Her father's uncertain new posture, her sister's lifted chin, her youngest sister's unwavering gaze, and held all of it at once. The love and the damage, and the long, complicated history of people who had failed each other and stayed anyway, and were now, finally, figuring out how to try differently. "Right," Violet said. "Specifically. Not just that you're well. Tell me about the land." "Every week," Ruth said. "The geological reports, the water measurements, all of it." The corner of Violet's mouth lifted. "Good." Elias clicked to the horses. The wagon moved forward down the frozen drive, and Ruth watched her family until the road bent and the trees closed, and they were gone. And she turned to face the north and the west and the long open country between here and Wyoming territory, where 2,800 acres of honest working land waited for the woman who was finally, irreversibly, on her way to claim her place in it. The cold was clean and complete, and the sky above the ridge was the pale particular blue of a November morning that promised nothing except itself, which was enough, which had always been enough, if you were the kind of person who understood that what the world actually offered was almost always more than what you'd been told you were allowed to want. Ruth Calloway. Ruth Weston now, or becoming it, the name still new and solid in her mind, like fresh-poured concrete, finding its final shape, faced the road ahead with the oilskin case secured in the wagon bed, and her mother's locket against her chest, and the certified water rights document that represented 14 months of invisible work, finally made permanent and real. She had not needed rescuing. She had needed someone to stand beside her in the room where the truth was being told, and recognize it as the truth, and choose her because of it, rather than in spite of it. That was what Elias Weston had done. Not saved her, seen her. And Ruth, who had spent 24 years making herself useful and invisible and indispensable and unasked, had finally done the one thing nobody had ever suggested she was allowed to do. She had looked at what was being offered, and looked at what she deserved, and discovered that for once in her life, those two things were the same. She had chosen herself. Everything else was just the road.